So welcome to our class on today. Tonight, I should say, we're going to be talking about, I guess you could say we're going to be talking about pseudepigrapha, and we're going to use Enoch as an example. And we're going to be talking about it as biblical interpretation, not just as pseudepigrapha. So what do I mean? What are pseudepigrapha, right? So are there pseudepigraphic, right, books? A pseudepigraphic book is a book that is written under a fake name, right? It's written in the name of someone that is not the actual author. Now, I'm actually going to correct myself here. That's not what I just said is the meaning of the word pseudepigrapha, but that's not what pseudepigrapha are. Because unfortunately, in the English language, we have decided to call things by names that don't match them at all when it comes to books written during the Second Temple period. Okay, so what we have are collections of books in the Second Temple period. There are books that make it into the Hebrew Bible, things that make it into our Tanakh. So those are books that are commonly considered from the Second Temple period. For example, Daniel, right, that we learned last year, is considered a Second Temple work, is considered academically a Second Temple work, but not traditionally a Second Temple work because it dates itself during the Persian period. We also have books that go ahead and say this book is from the Second Temple period. So, for example, that would be Ezra and Nehemiah. That would be Divrei Hayamim Chronicles. So we have certain works that say that, and Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, all prophets that are prophesying in the beginning of the Second Temple period, right, during the rebuilding of the temple. So those books date themselves in this period. So when we talk about books from the Second Temple period that are in the Hebrew Bible, I kind of mean both of those types of books that date themselves to the Second Temple period, as well as books that are generally considered to be Second Temple books.
Does the Divrei actually date itself?
Does Divrei Hayamim date itself? That is a good point, but it ends with Cyrus's declaration. So you have to say it's after Cyrus's declaration. It's got to be the earliest possible day, right? Is Cyrus's declaration that says everyone can go back, right? Vaya'al is famously the last word of the Bible, and you should go up, right? That the Jewish/Israeli people should return to their land. That is the last word of the Hebrew Bible, and that is the ending, because it is the ending of Divrei Hayamim of Chronicles, right? So that's why if the book work as a whole has to be understood to be from that time period at the earliest. So if we're talking about, again, Second Temple works, let's talk about collections, right? So there are the books that are actually in the Hebrew Bible. Then we have what we call the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha, literally meaning hidden things, were not hidden at all. These were books that this is what we call the books that were part of the Alexandrian Jewish Bible, the Greek Bible. Okay, now and I've said this before, that the Judean, we can call it the Judean Bible, what we consider the Massoretic Bible, was fairly conservative in what books it kept as part of the canon. And those books in general, I think it's pretty clear that those books had to have been considered divinely inspired. They couldn't just be fun books. They had to be books that people considered divinely inspired in some way. So if you knew the guy and he wasn't the prophet and he wrote the book, it couldn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. Hence, Ben Sira, a very well-respected work that all of the rabbis can quote, does not make it into the Hebrew Bible because it's written by Ben Sira, and Ben Sira is not a prophet. He does not live up to the time of the return to Zion, which is supposed to be the end of prophecy. He lives after that, in the Ptolemaic period in Judea. And so his book, while considered important, doesn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. It does, however, make it into the Greek Jewish Bible, the Alexandrian Bible, that is translated into Greek from various languages, sometimes from Greek itself, sometimes it kept the Greek. But those works include books like First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. Essentially, the Alexandrian Jews seem to have kept books that they considered edifying and important and not heretic, right? So in other words, a book like and not weird, books like Jubilees and Enoch did not make it into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible, but books like Tobit did. Tobit teaches good things about burying other Jews and helping and charity and marrying your cousin. So all of these seem to be good things. And there's an angel in it, and it's a really fun story. So that makes it into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible because it's a good book. And the books of the Maccabees are valuable historical works that also have a religious bent to them. But First Maccabees actually much less than Second Maccabees. But they're not any Judean would say those books can't be divinely inspired. They're works of history, essentially. Even Second Maccabees, which has a lot of miracles in it, is written in Greek, right? It's not actually, doesn't actually need to be translated. It was originally written in Greek. It actually seems to be, it says that it's a shortened version of a longer work in Greek. Book of Tobit was probably originally in Aramaic. The book of First Maccabees was originally in Hebrew. Everything, though, was translated or maintained in Greek in the Septuagint, all these apocryphal books. How do we have the Apocrypha if the Alexandrian Jewish community got pretty badly wiped out as part of during the kind of the Jewish diaspora rebellion later on? So how do we have these books? Because the Christians kept them, right? Because it was a natural thing to do with the earliest, you can even say, the Jesus movement, which is what they call Christianity before the church, right? When it's a bunch of Jews following Jesus, right? And then they start spreading the news, and essentially the Gospels, or at least a large part of the Gospels, are written to show that Jesus is supposed to be the culmination, the fulfillment, bringing into being. I'm missing the word. The bringing it into being of the Jewish prophecy. So you need to have
fulfillment.
The fulfillment. Thank you. He's meant to be the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, or biblical prophecy, I should say. He's meant to be the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So they need the biblical books in order, otherwise, what's he exactly fulfilling? And they need it in a way that's going to be comprehensible to everyone around the Mediterranean, which is where they're going, certainly where Paul's going to spread the good word, right? So they've got a Greek Bible. It's the Septuagint. It's super accessible. They take it, and that's how they put the New Testament in it. And that's how they kind of spread the word, and that becomes the Christian Bible, right? So even though you have works like Judith in there, where you're like, well, this is kind of an allegory for the Jewish people or actually maybe even for Zion. Judith seems to be kind of representing Zion, perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. So they take, that's part of the Christian Bible, and they interpret Judith as being the church, right? So you have these works that are, or Maccabees, which is absolutely kind of a national historical / theological work pertaining to the Jews, gets its own kind of life as part of the Christian Bible.
So
that's that. So wait. So I just want to clarify something in terms of the wording, because why was I talking about all this? Because those books, those Second Temple works that make it into the Septuagint, but not the Hebrew Bible, are called the Apocrypha. That's what we call them. Okay, it's not a great match of the name to the work. And then when we say, oh, that's apocryphal, meaning that's fake, I believe that comes from the fact that in the Reformation, right, when they're like, oh, let's look at the Catholics and see what they did wrong. They're like, hey, these books aren't in the Hebrew Bible. They're not real books. They're apocryphal. Let's throw them out, right? And then they take that out, and then those books become the intertestamental literature, right? If you ever read intertestamental literature, that's what it's talking about. It's talking about the Apocrypha, because they're between the Testaments, they're between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So they're taken out by Protestants and left in by Catholics. Okay, and those are what we call Apocrypha. That's another collection. Okay, I'll pause for your question. Yes. I don't hear you. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah. I think it sounds like there's something beautifully ironic about the fact that the Alexandrian Jewish community treated the Apocrypha as something sacred, because I mean the sort of the bottom line of the books of the Maccabees is the triumph of the so-called fundamentalists over the Hellenists, and the Alexandrian Jewish community was pretty Hellenized.
Well, but the Apocrypha are not. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, you can say, oh, they were pretty Hellenized, but the Apocrypha, if you read the Apocrypha, like you read Ben Sira, that he's not super Hellenized. I mean, I wouldn't want to be his wife and I wouldn't want to be his daughter, but he reads really nicely in between the, if you read, he really does read like a book that kind of works between the Bible and the Mishnah. Like it really just slots right in there. And I think that's why Chazal, like the rabbis of, of later periods, really, they liked Ben Sira. They knew him by, some of them clearly knew him by heart. They're quoting him by heart. And again, they didn't keep Jubilees and they didn't keep Enoch. I mean, Jubilees and Enoch were not super big on Hellenizing, I'll admit, okay? They do keep First and Second Maccabees, which are they have their own, it's interesting because First Maccabees has a very kind of, anti-foreign ruler stance, where Second Maccabees has a stance of, well, foreign rulers aren't by their nature bad, but something bad happened to kind of lead up to all this, right? But the Septuagint kept both. They kept both works. If you look at the Apocrypha in general, they're pretty nationalistic works. They're not super into Hellenizing ideas, I would say. On the contrary, I mean, we could, I would love to just say, hey, let's just talk about all of them now, but that wasn't the class. So, but there's absolutely an idea of, and again, I really like, and I've mentioned this before, I really like the argument that Tobit is written actually as a reaction to Zoroastrian ideas, that it's written in a Persian context, where he has to say, that's why I buried it, and I made sure to bury everyone, even though they weren't going to bury them. And like, that's a big thing there. And kind of how Tobit deals with that kind of a Zoroastrian Persian kind of religion living within it, right? But in general, I'm thinking offhand, and anyone who wants can jump in. I don't remember a super Hellenizing piece of any book in the Septuagint that comes to mind. The only thing you can say that is Second Maccabees, which is originally a Greek work written in the diaspora, does not take a negative view of foreign rulers per se, right? In other words, it doesn't say, oh, well, all I have to say is that Antiochus is a foreign king and he's ruling Israel. Like, that's all I gotta say. Like, obviously he's evil, right? That's not Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees is like, no, let's give you the history. Let's explain why he was upset, and there were a lot of misunderstandings and So, but in general, it's not a super Hellenizing collection. It is a collection of books that are written later. It does include books that are clearly dating themselves, that you have to accept were written later, or books that are kind of strange, that are really hard to believe, right? The books that are really hard to believe they happened, or they're kind of wild. Tobit, like, what? He's not a prophet, right? Why am I reading about him and his unusually caused blindness? Like, why? And the answer is because it's a really good story. It's a fun, edifying story. It teaches you good values, good things happen in the end. There's an angel in it. There's a demon in it. What's bad, right? This is a fun story. And it is a fun story, right? Why not keep it? I wonder also how much of it has to do with the fact that Alexandrian Jews were relatively prosperous and could copy a lot more books and keep them, right? There's a whole large community. They're living in one place. They're fairly prosperous. They can keep copying all these books. even if they don't think they're the holiest things in the world, these extra books, right? They're like, okay, these are good. Why not read them? And why not keep them? And why not copy them? Whereas the Jews in Judea were dealing with a lot more issues, and maybe, and also possibly more, maybe, and possibly just didn't have the wherewithal to just say, hey, I'm just going to copy this, not because I find it super religious or super holy, but because I think it's a good book, right?
One more question.
Yes.
So the original Christian idea of canonizing the Apocrypha, does that go back to the Gnostics and the precursors to the Coptic Church?
So first of all, this is important. I've mentioned this before. I'm trying to. I think Jean Ulrich has a really good, just like one couple sentences of, and I have to find it, where he just kind of lays down the difference between how Christians and Jews think of canon. And you realize this, like I, as a PhD student, I'm talking to a Christian, we're kind of arguing about what's canonized, what's in the canon. And at a certain point, you realize that you're using the word differently. What Jews call being in the canon is different from what Christians call being in the canon, because Christians have this idea that you need some kind of seal of approval that says this is in the canon. Now, everyone says it's in the canon because it got the seal of approval. It is now part of the canon. Whereas Jews have this idea of it's in the book, right? I mean, it is in the book. I mean, it's in the book, right? I mean, everyone was learning it. Everyone was reading it. It's in the book. We quote it. It's in the canon, right? And that's because of Christianity's history of being a national religion relatively early on. Not early enough for them, really, because there was a lot of bad stuff happening to them before that. But yeah, they were a national religion really early on, and when you're a national religion, you got to decide on the rules, and you got to decide what's in. And you've got an emperor saying, "Hey, if you want to make it a national religion, let's decide on some rules, right?" So then you have to decide what's in, right? You have to actually make things a canon, and decide what's in the canon officially. Now, we do have those passages where we say what books cause impurity of the hands, and those books are the ones that are in the canon. I'm not saying that we don't have these statements, but it really seems like those statements are coming out after it's already known what's in the canon and what isn't. Everyone knows these books are holy. I always quote, and I never get it completely right, the guy who says he goes up, the guy who allowed us to have Ezekiel in the canon, because he went up to like the attic with the candle. He's like, I'm not coming down till I solve every problem in Ezekiel. The question is, well, why did he have to do that? Couldn't he just say there are problems? Let's leave it out. No, it was in. Everyone knew it was in. Someone had to go up and say, no, I'm going to solve all the problems, and everyone can feel good about it being in, right? It was in. Everyone knew this was a holy book. Now, in the Second Temple period, it's very clear that there are books on the edge which are accepted as holy by some people and not accepted by as holy by others. It's very clear that there are books on the edge during this period, right? So classically, Esther, of course, is not a Qumran. It doesn't surprise us. Why would Qumran have a book that's essentially saying why you would have a festival type holiday every year? That really wouldn't be their kind of vibe. But other books, Jubilees does seem to be part of the Qumran canon, okay? And then, of course, you have in Alexandria, you have a much wider canon. It's harder to tell for Alexandrian Jews just how much they would, let's say, quote these other books. When we talk about Philo and who was a member of the Alexandrian Jewish community, and what he's quoting, what he's looking at as holy, he's talking about the 5 books of Moses. He's talking about the Chumash, the Chamisha Chumash Torah. That's the Torah. That's what he's talking about. That is when we talk about the letter of Aristeas, which is saying about the miracle of these 70 or 72 elders who are translating the Bible exactly the same because they had to when they're put in separate, whatever it was, right? Whether in separate rooms or not in separate rooms, they're talking about the Torah. They're talking about those 5 books. Philo makes an argument saying, because these books were translated miraculously, I can examine the Greek of the book as if Moses himself said it in Greek, right? In other words, he doesn't say as if Moses himself said it in Greek. He says, I can analyze the words of the Greek Torah as if this, and he'll say, and Moses, and he'll say, and I'm specifically saying Moses because I say, and Moses says, and he'll quote him in Greek, and he'll analyze the Greek words, right? Now, whether or not Philo knew Hebrew, and this is an argument, did Philo know Hebrew, or did he have just some word lists, and that was it? Whether or not he knew Hebrew, he's analyzing it in Greek because he says it's miraculous. It was miraculously translated, and therefore I can, and miraculously translated through, God's, inspiration, and therefore through divine inspiration, and therefore I can understand it as if this is how it was actually given to Moses.
So
Yes.
Philo spreads that. Go ahead, Sarah.
I did, yeah. I my internet was a little bit up and down. So, what did you say about Jubilees and Enoch? They were in the Alexandrian canon.
No. So Jubilees and Enoch do not make it into the Alexandrian canon. That's what brings us to the Pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha is the word. It means written under a fake name, right? But in fact, we use the term to include books that are also not written under a fake name. It is essentially used to include books. There are the Jewish Pseudepigrapha and the Christian Pseudepigrapha. So you'll see references to it's just because it says, like, whenever I say Pseudepigrapha, I automatically mean the Jewish Pseudepigrapha, but there are Christian Pseudepigrapha as well. So the Jewish Pseudepigrapha are books that are written in general, either during the Second Temple period or not long after. They're written by Jews, but they don't make it into the Hebrew Bible or into the Apocrypha, okay? They instead are kept in general by some church somewhere. And they are analyzed to say, is it Christian or is it Jewish? And everyone kind of agrees it's Jewish. Sometimes, first of all, because we find, Qumran helped with that also, because we found all sorts of little fragments of these books at Qumran. Usually teeny fragments we wouldn't have recognized if we didn't have the original work. Like, it doesn't always shed a particular light on the work itself, but you can see from the similarity, you can see that, yes, it's from this book. And also a lot of times it's, you can see it because there's a lack of Christological elements. There's a lack of elements that are specifically kind of Jesus or Christ oriented, right? It's not, so there, and then there are books that people argue about. Classic work, and it's actually is a pseudepigraphic work. It's is the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs.
What did you say? The Testament?
Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. It's a book. It's like the last testaments of the 12 tribes, the children of Jacob, the sons of Jacob, I should say. And it's a Christian book. Like, in its final form, it is a Christian work. You've got Jesus kind of inserted in all sorts of places. Now the question, then there's an argument, can you take out those references and what you're left with is a Jewish work? Or do you need to treat this as a Christian work? There was an interesting split between essentially Israeli scholarship and external scholarship. And I think that this is because very early on, when this book was first kind of studied, you had a version of it going around in Hebrew. It was from Kahana, right? Who did all the Hebrew translations of these what we call in Hebrew Sfarim Chitzoniyim, books external to the Hebrew Bible. So in Hebrew, we have a nice simple word that means all the books that are external to the Hebrew Bible. So he has a translation into Hebrew of all of those. Okay. So he early on, so he just took out the Christian references, translated the rest of it into Hebrew, and here you have it, a Jewish work. So in Israel, this was generally considered a Jewish work with Christian interpolations. Outside of Israel, there was much more of an argument, but in general, it's considered a Christian work. James Kogel considers it a Jewish, after studying, considers it a Jewish work with Christian interpolations. I have to say that based on what I have seen in Jewish Second Temple works in terms of how they deal with sin and how they generally almost never, but they do once, almost never combine the idea of an evil inclination and a demonic force. And yet in this work, it's combined all the time. I do think that it's either later than Second Temple period or is not purely a Jewish work with simple interpolations. But James Kogel is much bigger than I am for good reason. And I will leave it to you to decide.
Miriam?
Yes.
Did I understand you correctly? A question and a comment. Did I understand you correctly that Philo took the Kedusha, so to speak, of the Greek of the Septuagint of the Chumash, and then extended it to the Tanakh?
No. So if that's how it came across, I'd like to correct that. Okay. What Philo was doing, on the contrary, he doesn't talk about the other translations. He talks about the translation of the 5 books of Moses. That's what he's interpreting. Okay. I think it's important here, and it looks to me like we're not going to get to much of Enoch. We'll probably do that next class, but this is very important to kind of lay the groundwork for how we're going to look at these works. So what Philo does is he says, so when you're studying the Septuagint, and I'm not, there are people who that's all they do. There's a field called Septuagint studies where they just study the Septuagint. Okay, so there's a whole field. But in general, when you talk about the Septuagint, you call the translation of Chamisha Chumshei Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, you call that the Old Greek. That was the first piece that was translated. We have different versions of that Greek translation done by different people. Okay, and that's the oldest translation that you can absolutely understand. They needed to read the Torah in their shuls, in their synagogue, right, where they were actually their proseuchai, right, their places of prayer, right, in the diaspora they were actually called places of prayer, not just gathering places. A synagogue that's a literal translation of a Beit Knesset, a place where you gather, right? So they needed, and Philo says this is what they did. They studied the law all day. This is what they did in Shabbat. They would go essentially to shul and they'd study the Torah all day, right? And in general, certainly in Alexandria, Jews could no longer understand Hebrew in any real way. So you need to have it in Greek. You've got to have the Torah in Greek. And so the Torah is the first thing that gets translated into Greek. And again, we have different versions, etc.
And I take it they didn't know Aramaic either.
I don't assume that, but certainly if you want to read something easily, I assume that it would at least be, I don't know enough about that. I'm assuming not. I assume not. Even if they did, it's hard to know, because this is being translated into Koine Greek, right? So Koine Greek is your basic common Greek for people who aren't coming from Athens, right? They're learning Greek as they might be learning Greek as a second language. It's not a super complex Greek, and of course that is what you translate into. Some works have higher level Greek than others. Philo tries to write in kind of a higher level of Greek, trying to kind of more approach Attic Greek because he's a philosopher, so he studied philosophy in Attic Greek. But it's hard to know whether they would have known Aramaic, and I assume not. And again, like Tobit, they think that Tobit was written originally in Aramaic. They think that the Book of Enoch, well, that's something separate. They think the Book of Enoch was originally in Aramaic, and that would something that someone in Judea would read in Aramaic. Someone in Judea would naturally read Aramaic, and someone in Alexandria apparently probably not. But the books of the Torah are not written in Aramaic; they're written in Hebrew, and they needed to be able to read them and understand them. Okay, guys, if there's any background noise, please mute yourselves. So if so they needed to have that in Greek, right? And that's what Philo is talking about. Philo essentially writes an allegorical interpretation of the biblical books, addressing certain problems of interpretation, but also wanting to kind of explicate some of his own ideas. And what he's looking at is simply the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. He's not dealing pretty much with beyond that. This is what he wants. That's what he wants to interpret literally, like going into the words that are chosen and what do things mean. That's what he wants to look at. He's not. So in other words, what I'm saying is, so we know from Philo that Philo wants to say that the 5 books of Moses, as translated into Greek, are holy in and of themselves. They have pretty much the status of the Torah in Hebrew. I don't know whether he would think that written in terms of their writing, they would have the status, but that he can interpret them in terms of in the same way. I don't know what he would say about the other books, right? I don't know what people thought about the other books in terms of, is the Greek translation the same level as the original Hebrew? Are these extra books, are they holy? Is 1st and 2nd Maccabees holy? Is Judith holy? Now, of course, these stories kind of come back into Judaism, and some of them seem to kind of never leave exactly. And then that becomes a question of like, how do they survive? Are they simply coming back through from Christianity, or have some of them kind of trickled through? And we have that question as well, and we'll get to that in a future class when we look at the story of the Watchers. And some of you have heard me talk about this before, but we really do need to talk about it in the framework of interpretation, that there is a reflection of this myth / story / whatever / interpretation. There is absolutely a reflection of this in Chazal, in the Talmud, right? When it talks about the sin of Uzzah and Azael, right? Being repented in, being atoned in the Yom Kippur service. And then Rashi right away connects it to the Watcher story without a problem. So we'll talk about that when we get there. So at any rate, okay, so we have our.
Yes. when you say Septuagint, it's just the 5 books of Moses.
Okay. Again, when I say Septuagint, I mean the whole thing. I mean all the translations of all the books plus the extra stuff. That's what I mean when I say Septuagint, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, if I were talking to an academic, I would say Old Greek for the translation of the 5 books of Moses, as opposed to Septuagint. And when I said Septuagint, I mean the other books, right? Because it's translated later, it's translated piecemeal. Yeah.
But the whole legend of the Septuagint with the translators, the 72 translators, that was
about the 5 books. Is about the 5 books. That is right.
That's the Chumash.
So yes. So when they said Septuagint, they probably meant the 5 books, mm-hmm. right? When we say Septuagint, because we're just talking about the whole Greek Bible, the whole Greek canon.
Alexandrian.
Yeah. So that's, I guess Greek linguistically and Egyptian in terms of the geographically.
So did the Alexandrian community themselves think of their tradition as a canon, or was it just like their?
Okay, so it's not super. That's what I'm saying. It's because in general, Philo talks more about the 5 books. He does, I think, mention the tripartite canon, right? Which is, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. But it's not, I can't say, I don't know, right? This is something where I don't know. You can say, is the fact that they were copying them, that they had them together in a collection, does that mean that they saw them all? How do they think of them as a canon, right? Again, once you're in this fuzzy world of the canon are the books that are collected in the collection, right? Then you have this thing of, well, why? So that's what we have, that question. We have that question, why in Jewish canons in general, right? So, and then when we get to the pseudepigrapha, these books that are outside of these collections, and we have Enoch and Jubilees. Then we have the question of, okay, so why weren't these kept? Well, Enoch and Jubilees both kind of push a solar calendar. That could be a reason. Enoch and they both have certain ways of talking about history, holidays. They're also weird. They're very strange books, and they're rewriting things in ways that Enoch is a strange book because it's just just creating things out of not much, and Jubilees is retelling a story that everyone knows from Bereshit and Shemot, from Genesis and Exodus, and saying, oh, what you read, that was wrong. This is what really happened, right? So you could see why someone would be like, okay, this is not for real. This is not, no, right? And Enoch is written in Aramaic to begin with. So that's already kind of putting it farther from acceptance by someone as part of a biblical canon. I mean, Daniel still makes it in, right? That's one of the questions you always have. How did Daniel make it in, right? That's a question, right? That's a question. But for these other books, you can absolutely understand, especially when you start reading them, why they were out. And that's why I say when you read the books of the Apocrypha, the extra books in the Septuagint, you can say extra books in the Septuagint, none of them are going to shake your faith, right? None of them are going to shake your faith, and none of them are going to create real legal problems in general. Like you're generally not, okay, the way Tobit describes, the redemption of, like, that just doesn't completely make sense, but it didn't make sense in Ruth either. It doesn't make sense in Ruth. We don't have a problem with that. It's not, there's nothing that's super against anything that you would be, even like in a kind of a rabbinic world, be like, okay, all right. And the fact is that the story, the Judith story, becomes very kind of, it just, it kind of sinks into the story of Hanukkah, right? So that there are things that are kind of absorbed in a way into the rabbinic tradition. My teacher Larry Schiffman used to say, he said, if you read the Talmud, none of the rabbis seem to know the names of the Maccabees, but they've all got names of Maccabees. Yehuda, just like they've all got names of Maccabees. Like, so along the line, people are keeping these names. It's a very interesting kind of mix, and you really do have when I was a kid, I knew the story of Judith more or less. I had never read the book, right? I didn't know that there was a book of Judith that was kept in Greek, probably a translation. People like, I didn't know that, but I knew the story of Judith, right? I knew it was connected to Hanukkah, right? And these are, so there are things that do either make their way back in or kind of continue on. So
how do we know that Jubilees and Enoch were not read in Alexandria? Because they haven't continued in the Christian?
Oh, we don't know. Look, we can't. If you said to me, okay, Miriam, I'm going to bet you $1 million. I'm like, no, I'm not betting $1 million. In fact, Jubilees was translated into Greek first, right? And Enoch was probably also translated to Greek first, and then they were translated into Ethiopic. Okay, and that's how we have them for the Ethiopian church. So
both of them.
Yes, as far as I know, both of them, yes, were translated into Greek, and that's at least what we think. We do have fragments of Book of the Watchers, I believe, in Greek, actually. From Enoch. In Jubilees, we have fragments in Hebrew from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it in general, I believe they're both understood to have been translated to Greek and only then translated into Ethiopic. So some Greek speaker was reading them, right? So it comes to the question of, when you have a canon, what determines that it's a canon? Yeah. Again, when we're talking about Jews, I'm not talking about a Christian canon. I'm not talking about, there's nothing official, because that's not how Judaism is. I can't say it's not how it's ever worked, because there has been a temple and there has been some sectoriality around it. At the same time, it's clear when at Qumran, they quote Jubilees, they're quoting it as a definitive text, right? And so they're looking at it as a holy text that you can quote, but you don't have a like it doesn't. But there are books that get a patch there. There are books that they go in and they translate. It's very hard to know how the conceptions of different works work, and it's hard to know in terms of was the Greek total Septuagint, was it being how collected was it? Was it always being kind of written on papyrus? It was always together. I mean, again, you have this thing where before you have a codex, right? You don't have a book, you've got scrolls. So all you have is a stack of scrolls, right? Now you know that the minor prophets, right, who are minor because they're short, not because they're not important, but the minor prophets are already being written on the same scroll, right? We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least some of them, right? So where they're already being collected on a single scroll because they're short and you want to keep them together. So there is already this idea of keeping things together, right? And in order, right? Everyone knows, like what does it, it seems like it's hard to know. And again, it's so hard to know because, and I'm not in part of Septuagint studies, so I can't say, oh, okay. So I don't know offhand, oh, they have reason to believe that in one collection, this book was left out, in another collection that did have that book, or I haven't heard anything like that. And I think that at this point, we're just speaking from an absence of knowledge. The same way we speak of an absence of knowledge when we talk about the Massoretic canon, the canon that we have today. How was it formed exactly? How did everyone agree? How did everyone, why, okay, so Shira Shirim is in there, Song of Songs is in there. Okay, Rabbi Akiva can say whatever he wants, but Song of Songs was already in there. Why? Right? Why is this collection of love poetry part of a Judean Bible, which is in general all stuff that's supposed to be from God? So you do get into the circular argument saying, well, if it's in there, it must have already been considered to be talking about the relationship between the nation and God, right? I like that explanation. At the same time, I know it's completely circular, right? It has to be, the collection is only if it's from God. So if it's the collection, they must not was from God, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how did everyone, was it because during the destruction of the Second Temple, is that when it became gelled, that these are the books, right? That it was more fluid before that, but once everyone's running, you have to be like, okay, this is it. Or was there already a much firmer idea? And again, people have tried to do this by doing counts of how many copies they found at Qumran of different works, right? And it does seem to be that the books of the Massoretic Bible are found more, but it's really hard. It's hard to know. And I do think that it is what does seem to be pretty clear is that there was already a general understanding of what books must be in. And then there were books at the fringes, and some made it in and some didn't. So we are almost to the end of our hour. My apologies to those who expected Enoch. We will do Enoch next week. Don't worry, Enoch will still be there. But it was important, I think, to explain. Oh, and there's one collection which I didn't get to because it was a new collection was newly discovered, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have things there, you have in the Dead Sea Scrolls copies of works that we knew of from the Septuagint, from the Apocrypha. We have copies, and again, those kind of copies are fairly fragmentary. Right? There are places where they do shed a little bit of light because they just got the right words, but mostly they don't. We'll have fragments of things from the Apocrypha, fragments of books from the Pseudepigrapha, and also works that we didn't know existed before, right? The Genesis Apocryphon. I can just go to a million of them, right? There are tons of books. And I do want to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is so important, that the same way that Qumran has copies of biblical books and apocryphal and books of the Apocrypha and books of the Pseudepigrapha, they also have copies of works that we didn't know about that weren't from the sect. There are things that they're copying that they composed or that someone in their history composed, and there are books that they're copying that they didn't compose, and we just didn't have them before. The Genesis Apocryphon, for example, is not from the sect. It's an Aramaic work. It's a retelling of a part of Genesis. We're probably missing, a fairly large part of it. And there are many other works like that we find that they may have liked, and so they kept a copy, sometimes more than one copy, but they didn't compose it themselves. This is, if we're talking about canon, this is a reflection that there are groups of Jews that are keeping and copying and reading books that don't stay in the traditional canon or even in what we can, the Alexandrian canon. And this doesn't, they might consider them holy works. They might consider them really, edifying works, educational works. These are books that they are reading and copying. And copying means that they're investing in having a copy. It's not so easy to get the parchment to copy it down. So there's a very wide range of works that we just didn't know existed that weren't even composed by the sect that we discovered as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there are, of course, sectarian works that we're also going to look at, because what we're looking at right now in terms of the frame of biblical interpretation, which are a new, like the Pesher, which is considered a different type of interpretation that was specific to the sect. But at the same time, they're also, besides copying biblical books, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, they're also copying other works that other groups of Jews were keeping and reading, writing and keeping and reading. So we're going to be discussing those also as we continue in this class. And one of those works is the Book of Enoch. So,
Miriam,
yes.
Did you give us a syllabus of the books that we are going to be covering?
Oh, I was could you mute yourself for a second, because I'm getting an echo. Sorry, it's just something on my side. Okay. So I actually didn't want to limit myself. So it's the same thing where certain questions are coming up and I want to be able to point to different works. So for example, let's say I don't have the Apocryphon of Moses, and then I'm like, oh, it came up, I really need to address it. Then I want to do that. I have a general idea of where I want to take this class, but I don't want to limit it. If you guys want a list of books, I mean, it's also going to depend on when I start losing people, right? If everyone's like, okay, that's it, we've had enough, I'll just say, okay, but this one you've got to learn about. We got to talk about this. You got to talk about this. Let's just have a class on this, and then we'll close. But and that you're laughing, but that really is true. Like, I can go with this for years, so let's not do that. And I'll keep track. I want to make sure that I cover the most important stuff first. Like Enoch is super important. We're going to keep coming back to it also, because next class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about the books of Enoch as an interpretation of the verses on Enoch, and how we get all these books from this one little reference. And later on the following class, I hope, we're going to come back to the whole story of the Watchers and how it develops from Enoch to Jubilees. Okay, so there are certain things where I'm also going to be leaving certain pieces for later. There's certain books that we're going to go back to more, and certain books we're going to reference. So I'm talking about the Genesis Apocryphon. We will discuss it more in depth. We're not going to skip it. If you hear a book that I'm constantly referencing, we'll get to it. And you can also call me on it. You're like, hey, didn't you say something about, Amram? I'm like, oh, yeah. Oh, right. We'll do it. So, but I talk about the Genesis Apocryphon a lot because it's a very interesting work, and we will absolutely get to it. So what I want to say is, one of the things we're going to be, one of the important works that is kept by a larger group of Jews outside of Qumran, is also read at Qumran, but doesn't make it into the Massoretic Bible or the Septuagint, is the Book of Enoch. And what we're going to look at is just how much it reflects kind of different almost literary impetuses, you could say, that existed in the period, where while still drawing from the biblical verses. There's a reason why different things are connected to Enoch. And so we'll talk about that next time. And we'll also keep in mind that, again, here we have a work that is Jewish, or it's actually, and I've said this before, it's a collection of different works. And all of them, except possibly for one, are Jewish. They don't make it, it does continue a little bit in the Christian tradition. It doesn't continue in the Jewish tradition until, it does not continue in the Jewish tradition, but clearly there was a larger group of Jews that saw these books as important and saw the character of Enoch, of Hanoch, as very important in terms of just explaining what's out there, especially what's in heaven and kind of the world of angels and the future, what will be in the future. So thank you for joining me. And next week we will discuss Enoch and the different books of Enoch and how and why this figure is so evocative for Jews of this period.